What if I told you the richest empire in history wasn't built by warriors, kings, or conquistadors, but by a bunch of fishermen living in a literal swamp? Picture this. It's 1650. The most powerful man on earth isn't the Spanish king with his silver mountains. It isn't the Ottoman sultan with his armies. It's a Dutch merchant you've never heard of sitting in Amsterdam calculating interest rates on spice shipments. And here's the crazy part. This tiny country that shouldn't even exist, where half the land is underwater, is about to prove something that terrifies every dictator and emperor in history. You don't need an army to conquer the world. You just need better bookkeeping. In the next 40 minutes, I'm going to show you how the Netherlands went from irrelevant swamp to global superpower, how they invented capitalism, crashed the economy with flowers, and accidentally created your 401k. Oh, and how they did it all while selling drugs. Lots and lots of drugs. This is the story of the Dutch Golden Age, and it's going to change how you think about money, power, and why your country probably isn't as smart as it thinks it is. Let's dive in. Imagine trying to build a civilization in a bathtub while someone keeps turning on the faucet and occasionally throws in a hurricane. Welcome to the Netherlands. The name literally means the lowlands, and they're not joking. A quarter of the country is below sea level. In the 1600s, it was worse. Nearly half the country was either underwater or about to be. There's a Dutch saying, "God created the world, but the Dutch created the Netherlands." And this isn't some poetic metaphor. They literally built their country, by hand, one polder at a time. A polder is land reclaimed from the sea. You build dikes to hold back the water, you dig channels to drain it, you pump, constantly, forever. If you stop pumping for even 2 weeks, the sea reclaims what's hers. It's the most expensive, labor-intensive, ridiculous way to create farmland ever conceived, and the Dutch did it for centuries. So why? Why would anyone choose to live here? Because nobody else wanted it. The Netherlands was the reject pile of Europe. Poor soil, terrible weather, the main industries were fishing and drowning. It was a backwater of a backwater inherited by Spain through a series of royal marriages that made sense to exactly no one. But the Dutch had one thing going for them: water. Not the kind that floods your house, the kind that moves cargo. See, they sat at the mouth of the Rhine River, the highway of European trade. Anything moving between Germany and the rest of Europe had to pass through Dutch territory. And the North Sea gave them access to fishing grounds and trade routes stretching to Russia, England, and beyond. The Dutch couldn't farm worth a damn, so they became something else entirely, the middlemen of Europe. They'd buy grain from Poland, fish in the North Sea, transport everything everywhere, and take a cut on every single transaction. They were becoming the Amazon of the 16th century, except with wooden ships and questionable labor practices. Actually, scratch that. Those are pretty similar. But here's where this story really begins. Remember Spain from our last video? The country that found a mountain of silver and went bankrupt 5 times? Well, Spain owned the Netherlands. And they were about to learn that some tenants don't just stop paying rent. They burn down the building and start their own empire. Meet Philip II of Spain, absolute monarch, devout Catholic, defender of the faith, and quite possibly the worst landlord in human history. Philip inherited the Netherlands from his father, and he treated it like a personal ATM. He taxed the Dutch to fund his wars in Italy. He stationed Spanish soldiers in Dutch cities, soldiers who didn't speak Dutch, didn't like Protestants, and apparently didn't understand the concept of not being jerks to the locals. But the worst part? Philip decided to enforce Catholic orthodoxy in a region that was rapidly turning Protestant by burning people at the stake in public squares. For the Dutch, this was it. They weren't just angry about taxes, though those were crushing. They weren't just upset about foreign soldiers, though that was humiliating. They were done with religious persecution. In 1568, the Dutch revolted. And this should have been a massacre. Spain had the silver of the Americas, the best army in Europe, the most powerful navy afloat. They were literally the richest, most powerful empire on Earth. The Dutch had fishing boats and an attitude problem. This war would last 80 years. 80 years. Think about that. The war started when Shakespeare was 4 years old. It didn't end until he'd been dead for 33 years. And somehow, impossibly, the Dutch were going to win. How? Because while Spain was spending money, the Dutch were about to invent an entirely new way of making it. Imagine if Amazon had its own army, its own navy, and the legal right to invade countries, sign treaties, and start wars. That sounds insane, right? Dystopian even. Well, the Dutch did it in 1602, and it made them the richest people on Earth. While still fighting Spain, remember, a war they're supposed to be losing, the Dutch created the Dutch East India Company, the VOC. But this wasn't just a trading company. This was something the world had never seen before. The VOC had its own army, its own warships, and a charter from the Dutch government that gave them the power to wage war, establish colonies, and sign treaties with foreign nations. It was a corporation with the powers of a nation-state. But here's the really revolutionary part. They funded it through the world's first IPO. Anyone could buy shares. Rich merchants, sure, but also middle-class craftsmen, shopkeepers, even servants pooled their money to invest. In Spain, only the king and nobles controlled capital. In the Netherlands, a baker could own a piece of global trade. The Amsterdam Stock Exchange opened in 1602 to trade these shares, making it the oldest stock exchange in the world. And immediately, people figured out you could make money not just from the company's profits, but from trading the shares themselves. Speculation was born. For better or worse. The VOC had one goal: break Portugal's monopoly on Asian spices. Spices were the oil of the 17th century, incredibly valuable, controlled by a single power, essential to everyone who could afford them. Portugal had spent a century building a network of fortified trading posts from Africa to Indonesia. The Dutch approach? Superior violence and better accounting. In that order. Let me tell you about a spice so valuable that an entire civilization was genocided for it. That spice was nutmeg, and what the Dutch did to get it is one of the darkest stories in economic history. In the early 1600s, nutmeg only grew wild on a handful of tiny islands in Indonesia, the Banda Islands. The Bandanese people had been trading nutmeg for centuries, selling to whoever offered the best price. Portuguese, Chinese, Arab traders, everyone was welcome. It was free trade in its purest form. Then, the VOC arrived. The Dutch didn't want a favorable trade deal. They didn't want to be the preferred partner. They wanted a monopoly. Total, complete, absolute. So, in 1621, under Governor-General Jan Pieterszoon Koon, they did the unthinkable. They systematically murdered or enslaved virtually the entire population of the Banda Islands. Out of 15,000 Bandanese, fewer than 1,000 survived. The VOC then transplanted Dutch colonists to the islands and established nutmeg plantations worked by enslaved labor. I need to be crystal clear about something. The Dutch Golden Age was built on unspeakable violence. While Amsterdam was becoming the most prosperous city in Europe, Dutch merchants were committing genocide for spices. The wealth flowing into the Netherlands was blood-soaked. But, and stay with me here, because this is important to understand how the Dutch system worked. From a purely economic standpoint, they were ruthlessly efficient. Spain extracted silver and consumed it. The Dutch extracted spices and added value. They'd buy nutmeg in Indonesia, ship it to Amsterdam, process it, package it, brand it, and sell it across Europe at massive markups. They weren't just moving goods, they were creating value chains. That's the difference between extraction and trade. By the 1620s, the VOC was the richest corporation in history. Adjusted for inflation, it was worth between $7 and $8 trillion. That makes it more valuable than Apple, Microsoft, and Google combined today. A single company from a tiny country was richer than most empires. Let that sink in. Now, I'm going to tell you the most boring secret to world domination you've ever heard. Ready? Double-entry bookkeeping. I know, your eyes just glazed over, but stay with me, because this is actually the most important part of the entire story. While Spanish nobles were obsessed with honor and glory, Dutch merchants were obsessed with ledgers and interest rates. While Spanish kings built palaces to show off, Dutch burghers built warehouses to store inventory. While Spain's economy ran on vibes and prayer, the Dutch economy ran on math, and that made all the difference. The Dutch invented or perfected modern accounting practices, marine insurance so merchants could manage risk, the stock market so capital could be efficiently allocated, bills of exchange, early banking instruments, futures contracts so traders could hedge, and short selling. Yes, the Dutch invented short selling. You can blame them for that. These financial innovations meant Dutch merchants could operate at a scale and efficiency that was impossible for competitors. They could spread risk across multiple ventures. They could raise capital cheaply. They could make rational decisions based on actual data rather than the king needs money for a war, so we're screwed. Let me give you a perfect example: shipbuilding. A Spanish galleon took years to build, cost a fortune, required specialized craftsmen for every single component. It was beautiful, it was heavily armed, it was a statement of power. Dutch merchants developed the Vloot, a cargo ship that was cheap, fast to build, and required a smaller crew. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't heavily armed, but it could carry twice the cargo at half the cost. And the Dutch built thousands of them using assembly line methods that wouldn't be seen again until Henry Ford started making cars. By the 1650s, the Dutch had more ships than England, France, Spain, Portugal, and Germany combined. Amsterdam's harbor was a forest of masts, ships from every nation flying every flag, all coming to the one place where you could buy anything, sell anything, ship anything. The Dutch weren't just trading, they were the trade. If you wanted to move goods in Europe, you used a Dutch ship, period. And they made money on everything. They'd transport French wine to Sweden, Swedish iron to France, and take a cut on both transactions. They'd buy English wool, turn it into cloth in Dutch workshops, and sell it back to England at a profit. They were the middlemen of the world economy, and the middleman always wins. The phrase "going Dutch," splitting a bill, comes from this era. The Dutch reputation for thrift and fair dealing was so strong that it entered the language. Though fair here means they'd calculate your share down to the last penny.
Okay, deep breath. Because I'm about to tell you about the single stupidest thing that's ever happened in financial markets. And I'm including NFTs in that assessment. And Dogecoin. And whatever crypto scam is trending when you're watching this. In the 1630s, the Dutch, these rational, calculating, mathematically minded merchants, became completely obsessed with flowers. Not just any flowers, tulips. Tulips had been imported from Turkey in the late 1500s. Dutch horticulturists discovered they could breed new varieties, and some of these tulips developed striking patterns, breaks of color that made each flower unique. The rare tulips became status symbols. Rich merchants would display them in their gardens like we display sports cars. Painters included them in portraits. They became the Rolexes of the plant world. Expensive, beautiful, and absolutely useless for anything practical. Prices started rising. A rare tulip bulb that cost a few guilders in the 1620s might sell for dozens by the early 1630s. And that's when speculators noticed. By 1636, tulip speculation had spread beyond wealthy collectors to ordinary Dutch citizens, craftsmen, farmers, servants. Everyone was trading tulips. Well, not actual tulips. Most people never even saw the tulips they were buying and selling. They were trading pieces of paper, promises of delivery, for bulbs that hadn't even been planted yet, that wouldn't bloom for months, that might not even exist. And the prices just kept going up and up and up. Until they didn't. At the peak of Tulip Mania in February 1637, a single bulb of the Semper Augustus variety sold for 6,000 guilders. Let me put that in perspective for you. A skilled craftsman earned about 250 guilders per year. That tulip bulb cost 24 years of wages. In today's terms, if you make $50,000 a year, that's like spending $1.2 million on a flower bulb that you're going to plant in dirt. People were mortgaging their houses to buy tulips. They were selling businesses, land, family heirlooms, everything they owned. Taverns became informal tulip exchanges where men would drink and trade bulb futures until dawn. Deals were scrawled on napkins. Fortunes changed hands on a handshake. Everyone had the same reasoning. Prices had gone up every month for years. Why would they stop? Someone would always pay more tomorrow than you paid today. It was foolproof. It was free money. It was inevitable. Then, in February 1637, someone blinked. The exact trigger is unclear. Maybe a bulb auction failed to meet reserves. Maybe a rumor spread. Maybe one rational person finally looked around and said, "This is stupid." But once it started, the collapse was brutal. Within days, prices were falling. Within weeks, they dropped 95%. Within months, they were back to normal levels. People who'd paid a year's wages for a bulb now held something worth the price of an onion. Fortunes evaporated overnight. Lawsuits flooded the courts. Families were destroyed. There were suicides, bankruptcies. Men who'd been wealthy on Monday were destitute by Friday. All over a flower. Now here's the weird thing about Tulip Mania. It didn't actually destroy the Dutch economy. Yes, individuals were wiped out. Yes, there were lawsuits and bankruptcies and suicides. But the broader Dutch economy barely noticed. How is that possible? Because the real wealth of the Netherlands wasn't based on tulip speculation. It was based on actual productive trade. While people were going insane over flowers, the VOC kept shipping spices. Amsterdam's merchants kept moving goods. Dutch shipyards kept building vessels. This is the crucial difference between the Dutch and the Spanish. When Spain's silver declined, their entire economy collapsed because they'd built everything on that single resource. When the Dutch tulip market crashed, life went on because it was just one speculative bubble in a diverse, productive economy. But Tulip Mania taught the world something crucial. Any asset can become subject to speculative mania, and all bubbles eventually pop. The pattern established in 1637 has repeated hundreds of times since. The South Sea bubble, the railway mania, the Roaring Twenties, the dot-com bubble, the housing crisis, cryptocurrency, NFTs. Every generation thinks this time it's different. It never is. And the Dutch invented the template. But here's what's truly remarkable. Despite Tulip Mania, the Amsterdam Stock Exchange kept growing. Traders learned lessons about risk management. Regulations were developed. The market became more sophisticated. The Dutch took their biggest financial disaster and turned it into a learning opportunity. That's the Dutch approach in a nutshell. Fail, learn, optimize, repeat. And that approach was about to create the greatest golden age the world had ever seen.
By the mid-1600s, if you wanted to see the future, you went to Amsterdam. Not Rome, not Paris, not London. Amsterdam. Ships from every nation crowded its harbor. The Bank of Amsterdam, established in 1609, was the most trusted financial institution on earth. Merchants conducted business in a dozen languages. Warehouses overflowed with goods from 6 continents. Amsterdam's population had exploded from 30,000 in 1570 to 200,000 by 1650, one of the largest cities in Europe. But unlike most large cities, which were full of poverty, disease, and open sewers, Amsterdam was clean, well-organized, prosperous. They had running water systems, efficient garbage collection, and building codes. Yes, building codes in the 1600s, while London was still dumping chamber pots out windows. The average Dutch citizen was wealthier than the average citizen anywhere else in Europe. They ate better. The Dutch had diverse diets with meat, fish, dairy, bread, vegetables. Most Europeans were subsisting on bread and hope. They lived in nicer homes. Even modest Dutch houses had glass windows, furniture, decorations. Most Europeans lived in one-room hovels. They were more educated. Literacy rates in the Netherlands were double or triple those in other countries. This wasn't just a wealthy elite. This was broad-based prosperity, the kind of middle-class society that wouldn't appear anywhere else for 2 more centuries. But wealth alone doesn't explain why we call this era golden. What made this era golden wasn't just money, it was culture. This is when the Netherlands became the creative and intellectual capital of the world. This is when Rembrandt painted The Night Watch, when Vermeer created Girl with a Pearl Earring, when Frans Hals, Jan Steen, and dozens of other masters were producing artwork that still dominates museums today. Dutch cartographers made the most accurate maps in the world. Dutch scientists invented the microscope and discovered bacteria. Antony van Leeuwenhoek looked through a lens and saw life invisible to the naked eye, opening up an entire universe of biology. Dutch philosophers like Spinoza revolutionized Western thought. He got excommunicated from the Jewish community and banned by Christians for his ideas, and Amsterdam let him keep writing anyway. The Netherlands became a haven for free thinkers from everywhere. When Descartes wanted to work in peace, away from religious authorities, he moved to Amsterdam. When Jews were expelled from Spain and Portugal during the Inquisition, they fled to tolerant Amsterdam. Why was the Netherlands so tolerant? Partly principle, sure. The Dutch valued individual conscience and freedom of thought, but mostly profit. The Dutch had learned something crucial. Religious persecution was expensive and stupid. Skilled workers came from all religious backgrounds. Wealthy merchants were Jewish, Protestant, Catholic, whatever. Banning them for their beliefs meant losing talent to competitors. So the Dutch developed a practical tolerance. Believe whatever you want, worship however you want, just pay your taxes and don't cause trouble. This attracted the best and brightest from across Europe. Amsterdam became a melting pot of talent. And that diversity drove innovation. It's the same reason Silicon Valley dominates tech. When you concentrate talent from everywhere, magic happens. But even golden ages don't last forever. By the late 1600s, if you looked closely, you could see cracks appearing in the Dutch miracle. First, war. Constant, expensive, grinding war. The Dutch fought 3 separate wars with England between 1652 and 1674, competing for maritime supremacy. They fought France during Louis XIV's aggressive expansion. They fought internal political conflicts between republicans and monarchists. War is expensive, even when you're winning, especially when you're winning, because you have to defend what you've won. Second, imitation. The Dutch had gotten rich by being smarter than everyone else, but you can't keep secrets forever. The English copied Dutch shipbuilding techniques. The French copied Dutch financial systems. The Germans copied Dutch manufacturing methods. The Dutch advantage was eroding.
When everyone knows your tricks, they stop being tricks. Third, complacency. The generation that built the Golden Age was hungry, innovative, willing to take risks and work 16-hour days. Their grandchildren? Rich and comfortable. Why take risks when you can live off your family's wealth? Why innovate when the old ways still work? Dutch merchants became Dutch rentiers. They stopped actively trading and started living off investments. Fourth, the VOC was dying. What started as a lean, efficient corporation had become a bloated, corrupt bureaucracy. Company officials in Asia were running personal side businesses, embezzling, taking bribes. The bookkeeping, the thing that made the Dutch great, became creative. Profits were inflated, losses were hidden. Dividends were paid from capital rather than actual earnings. The company that invented good corporate governance was falling apart. The Dutch Golden Age was ending, not with a bang, but with a slow, inevitable fade.
The Dutch Golden Age didn't end with a dramatic collapse. There was no invasion, no revolution, no catastrophic defeat. It just faded. Slowly and quietly, over the course of the 18th century, the Netherlands stopped being the center of the world. They remained wealthy. They were still one of the richest countries in Europe, but they were no longer the richest. That honor passed to Great Britain. The British had learned all the Dutch tricks, the financial innovations, the shipbuilding techniques, the trade networks, and they combined them with a larger population, more resources, and a better strategic position. The British East India Company eventually crushed the VOC. British ships replaced Dutch ships on global trade routes. London replaced Amsterdam as the financial capital of the world. And then came the wars. The Fourth Anglo-Dutch War was a disaster. The British seized Dutch colonies, captured Dutch merchant fleets, blockaded Dutch ports. By 1795, revolutionary France invaded and occupied the Netherlands. The Dutch fleet, once the pride of Europe, was captured by French cavalry on ice because the ships were frozen in harbor. Nothing captures decline quite like your navy being defeated by horses. By 1800, the Dutch Golden Age was definitively over. But here's the thing about the Dutch. The Dutch Golden Age teaches us 5 lessons that are just as relevant today as they were 400 years ago. First, institutions matter more than resources. The Netherlands had no gold, no silver, no natural advantages, no vast territory, no huge population. What they had was the rule of law, property rights, efficient capital markets, good governance. And that was enough. Second, diversity drives innovation. Amsterdam's tolerance wasn't just moral, it was strategic. Bringing together people from different backgrounds, religions, and cultures created a competitive advantage that homogeneous societies couldn't match. It's why diverse companies outperform, why diverse cities are more innovative, why immigration strengthens economies rather than weakening them. Third, trade beats extraction. Spain extracted silver from a mountain and stayed poor. The Dutch traded goods across the world and got rich. Creating value through commerce and production is more sustainable than just grabbing resources and hoping they last forever. Fourth, financial innovation is a double-edged sword. The Dutch invented modern finance, the stock market, insurance, futures contracts. These enabled their rise and created prosperity. But Tulip Mania showed that financial innovation can run amok. Every tool can become a weapon. Every system can be gamed. You need financial innovation to grow, but you need regulation and wisdom to keep it from destroying you. Fifth, all golden ages end. The Dutch were on top for maybe a century. That's it. 100 years of dominance out of thousands of years of history. Expecting to dominate forever is delusion. Every empire falls. Every golden age fades. The question isn't whether you'll decline, it's whether you can adapt when you're no longer number one. And that's where the Dutch proved something remarkable.
The Dutch proved something that terrifies every dictator and emperor in history. You don't need to be the biggest to be successful. You don't need to dominate the world to prosper. Spain had an empire where the sun never set. They went bankrupt repeatedly. The Netherlands was a tiny country you could bicycle across in a few days. They bought Spain's debts at a discount. Size doesn't matter. Resources don't matter. Military might doesn't matter. What matters is what you do with what you have. The Dutch took a swamp and built a civilization. They took a fishing industry and created global trade networks. They took a war for survival and turned it into an economic revolution. They failed constantly, but they failed forward, learning from every mistake and optimizing their approach. Today, the Netherlands is still wealthy, still innovative, still prosperous. They're not a superpower, they don't try to be, but they're consistently ranked among the happiest, healthiest, and most prosperous nations on Earth. They've maintained a high standard of living for 4 centuries, outlasting every empire that once overshadowed them. How? By focusing on what works, by building systems that last, by valuing competence over glory. The Dutch Golden Age teaches us that greatness isn't about having the most, it's about using what you have most effectively. Spain found a silver mountain and squandered it on wars and palaces. The Dutch started with mud and made it golden. They proved you could get rich by actually being smart about it, by building things, by trading things, by creating systems that worked, by doing the boring, tedious work of good bookkeeping and rational planning. It's not as dramatic as conquest, it's not as romantic as discovery, but it's a lot more sustainable. The Dutch went from fishing in a swamp to ruling the world economy. Then, when they couldn't rule anymore, they adapted and stayed prosperous anyway. Not bad for a bunch of people who technically live in the ocean. Thanks for watching. If you learned something today, hit that like button. Subscribe for more economic history that actually matters. And drop a comment telling me which empire we should destroy next. I'll see you in the next one.